Hello, welcome to Talk Wildlife, and today I am doing a special talk with a very special person because she's one of the authors of one of my favourite books. She's now got a new book out. That's Heather Buttivant, and today we're going to talk about Beach Explorer, which is an amazing book because I've got it, and even though I'm not a kid, which is the target audience, and even though I haven't got kids in my family, which is the other target audience, I love it, and I will be going out and having a play on the beach. So first of all, hi Heather, how are you?
Hi Alan, I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for having me along today.
No problem whatsoever. I'm still reeling from your last book, which is as I said, brilliant, as you know. Still one of my favourite books. I couldn't remember, because last year was such a non-entity, whether it came out at the beginning of last year or the end of the year before.
It came out in hardback a couple of years ago now, and the paperback came out last spring.
So. That's right. It was the paperback that came out. Yeah, and if you haven't got it, Rockpool, brilliant book. You have to get it. It's amazing. And that book, you changed the cover for the softback, because now I might have to get the softback as well. Right. Okay. So down to Beach Explorer. Let's sort of rewind first and talk about why beaches are so fantastic for families and for kids to explore.
Absolutely. Beaches are just an amazing environment. I don't think you have to tell children or families that beaches are fun. Everyone loves going to the beach, most people do. And beaches are particularly interesting because of the way they change all the time. So if you go to any beach regularly, you'll notice that the tide comes in and out twice a day. The weather can change the feel and the look of the beach in an instant. You can have massive waves, or it can be beautifully calm and clear. You've got different zones on the beach that are sometimes completely out of the water, sometimes in the water, and different things live there. And I think it's one of the few places where you can really come face to face with wildlife, and particularly with wildlife that is so very different from us. So wildlife that can only survive under the water, whereas we're the opposite. I think there's something very alien, something very intriguing and exciting about crabs and fish and starfish, that if you've ever watched any films with aliens in it, a lot of them are based on sea creatures because they're that strange to us. So I think the opportunity to go to a beach and get face to face with wildlife and understand it, and also to understand those big processes, like how those tides work. Why is it that the sea's salty? What is sand? And to learn about how to look after the beach. I think we all know now that there are problems. We have a lot of litter. We have climate change, something called ocean acidification. So what I've tried to do with my book really is to make all that accessible through hands-on activities that children can do by themselves or with their family.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a very good PR for the beach. That's for sure. And the thing is, you know, people do, I mentioned this when I interviewed you for Rockpool, you know, people do go to the beach, families do go to the beach, they spend a lot of time on the beach, and a lot of families do go rock pooling. So, you know, the attraction is already there. I think what this book is going to do is it's going to open up a whole new dimension about going on the beach. What I want to do is I want to talk about some of the activities that are in the book, because you mentioned soil and you mentioned other things that are actually covered in here. But I want to start off with, not soil, sand, obviously. We'll start off with sand. And the first thing in here, actually, one of the first things you can do is become a sand detective. And there's a couple of things around the sand detective activities that I want to talk about. First of all, sand on the beach. Let's give a little bit of the book away and talk about sand on the beach. So what is sand on the beach? You said what is sand. So what is sand on the beach, and how can kids and families go and explore that and find out for themselves what you're about to tell us?
Okay, so sand on the beach is actually completely fascinating, because every beach is different. The sand that you find on every beach is a little bit different from every other beach. And that's because the sand is made by wearing down rocks, shells, all sorts of other bits of material that either come from inland down rivers or are dropped into the ocean as the cliffs erode and you get bits of rock falling into the sea and those get worn down by the waves, or they come from living creatures themselves. So some of the sand, in some places, pretty much all the sand is made up of the shells of animals that were once living. So when you go to any beach, it will be different. And the kind of rocks or pebbles or sand that you get on the beach will depend on what kind of rocks are nearby. So if you go to some beaches in South Devon where they have the amazing red cliffs, the sand will be really quite red. A lot of places you'll find that the sand is full of glittery crystals, really transparent little hard crystals, which are quartz, because that's one of the hardest and most common rocks. So when that gets transported out, see, everything else gets worn down, and you have these glittering little crystals that are left behind. So the activity in the book is very much about exploring the beach to understand what kind of sand is there by looking closely at it. You may not even have sand, you may have little pebbles, you may have shingle or something else. To look really closely, understand where it's come from, why it looks the way it does, and to explore it closely by really taking the time to look. And I think a lot of the activities in this book are about stopping and looking closely at something with that little bit of guidance to what you might find so that you get more from it.
Yeah, and so I'm going to take you from, because obviously you live in the west of England. I'm going to just take you to the other side of the country for a second, because something that I think people will find fascinating and that will embellish what you just said about sand and, you know, how interesting it is. Tell people what the White Cliffs of Dover is made up of. Where do they come from? How are they made up?
Okay, so the White Cliffs of Dover are made of something that school children in the old days were very familiar with, less so now, something called chalk. And so chalk is a very soft white rock, and it used to be used a lot for writing on blackboards and still is. And it's used for that because it's so soft that as you move it across the surface, bits of it break off. Okay, it's very, very flaky. And that means that although it's a fairly hard rock compared to others in that area where Dover and places like that are, so it gets exposed because it's the hardest rock. It's also quite soft, so you get quite a lot of rock falls in that area, crumbly cliffs. You have to be careful at the edge of the cliffs around there. But the way it was made was on an ancient seabed. And what it's actually made of are the tiny little skeletons of planktonic, tiny little animals that fell to the seabed millions of years ago. And over time, more and more accumulated, they got compressed, and that turned them into rock. So effectively, what you have is cliffs made of the skeletons of tiny little animals.
Absolutely. Who can't be fascinated by that? And that's just one. I mean, I picked on one because everybody knows the White Cliffs of Dover and they can see them. But, you know, when you go out and you do start exploring the beach, and it's not just about the sand and the pebbles, and there's also a lot of beaches have fossils on them, so you can find fossils. So before you even get anywhere near the water, you've got activities. And I'm going to mention one more from the book, and that is what to do with a magnet on the beach. So
now, my son, who, as you might imagine, I spend a lot of time on beaches, so my son does too. He's spent, can't count how many hours on beaches with me. We went to the beach to just have a go at making a little video of some of the activities that are in the book. And we did this. We took a magnet to the beach and we ran it through some fine sand, some fine dry sand near the top of the beach. And he was so excited he would have spent all day doing it, because fairly quickly he had some tiny little bits, apparently of sand, sticking to his magnet. Obviously, without testing, you can't be sure exactly what you've got, But on a lot of beaches, you'll have little pieces of iron which stick to a magnet, which may occur naturally in the rock, or they may be from things that have been left in the sea, bits of old boats and fishing equipment or farm machinery that have got washed into the sea. Who knows? But you get little bits of iron. And some beaches, not many in the UK, but some beaches have magnetite, which is another type of metal that sticks to magnets. And there, if you move your magnet through the sand, you'll end up with a whole formation of little tiny magnetite particles stuck to your magnet. But finding any, it's just fascinating. Yeah.
It is. So that means now you take your bucket and you take your spade and you take a magnet, and that will get you going with a magnifier glass, and that'll give you endless amounts of fun on the beach, on the sand, before you even hit the water. Now, a couple of other ones I want to pick up on, and one of them is, how do you make a plankton net? Now, I picked on this one because it might be something that they need to do before they get to the beach, but how would you make a plankton net? What's that about?
Okay, so to take it back, plankton are tiny, tiny little plants and animals, mostly tiny little plants and animals. They're effectively anything that floats freely in the sea and doesn't really control the direction that it goes in very much. Okay, so unlike fish which swim with a purpose, or crabs that crawl along the bottom, plankton are little things that are just floating in the water. They can swim up and down, they can swim around, but they have very little control over where they move compared to the currents, okay? And that means that there are lots of tiny, tiny animals that are in the plankton, things like baby crabs, barnacles, some mollusks, seashells and things, have a planktonic stage. So they have tiny little animals that, until they're fully grown, just swim around before they settle. Other animals spend their whole lives in the plankton and are just designed to float around in it. And funnily enough, jellyfish, which can be really big, you can have a jellyfish 1 meter across, officially they are called plankton because they have very little control and they move with the currents. So if you want to find plankton, bearing in mind that most of them are so tiny that you can only see them with a microscope, you need a special net. And I won't go into a full Blue Peter style demonstration today, but but it is possible with just a few basic things that most people are likely to have around the house or can get very easy to make a little plankton net. Because what marine scientists do to study what's in the plankton, how much plankton there is, what's living there, is they'll take a very fine net with a pot at the bottom of it, and as they pull the net through the water, the water is forced out the sides of the net and the plankton is forced to the bottom of the net and falls into the jar. So if you make your little net correctly, and all you need is maybe a pair of tights and a bit of sticky tape, some things that you'd have at home, you can take that to the beach and have a go at sifting for plankton yourself and pulling it through the shallow water or through a pool and seeing whether you can collect anything in that jar. If you're successful, what you're likely to have is like a milky soup in the bottom of your jar. You may well see some little animals swimming around. So like I say, there are plenty of animals in the plankton that are actually quite big. So you might see things like little copepods that are a type of crustacean, a bit like crabs and prawns. They're tiny little things, they swim around. So you might see some actual animals, but mostly what you'll find is a milky soup. And of course, if you have access to a microscope, brilliant, take a little bit away, have a look at it under a microscope, because even like a teaspoon of seawater can contain absolutely thousands of these little creatures. And there are plants as well, but you probably won't be able to see those, certainly with the naked eye.
Excellent. Now, I know you've said that you won't be able to see those, but it's worth just mentioning to people, because to get an idea of this sort of the number of these sort of microorganisms, so very tiny plants, very tiny animals, to get an idea of sort of the sheer number of those, it's worth mentioning that when they bloom, so when they all gather, it can be seen from space.
Yes.
So this is tiny, tiny, tiny little things that there's so many of them that you can see them from space, which is phenomenal. So
there's also a little plankton which Plagian noctiluca, a little plankton that gets known as sea sparkle, because it blooms in huge numbers, and what happens is it has something called bioluminescence, so it can produce light, and when anything moves through and disturbs it, it can be a wave or a boat or even a dolphin or something swimming through the water, every little tiny little plankton sparkles. So you get a light, a glow in the water in breaking waves as boats move through water. The sea seems to light up with these things, which is just the most exciting thing ever. So if anyone if you hear that there's any sea sparkle in your area, make sure you get down to a beach at night and have a look. Brilliant thing to do with the kids, actually. Absolutely brilliant.
Definitely. And do you get that? So when you say get down to are we talking about around our course?
Yeah, you get it. It's completely random. It's most likely to happen in the warmer summer months, when there are big plankton blooms, as there's more energy from the sun to fuel all these little creatures and plants. But yes, it can happen around the coast. It normally only lasts a fairly short time, maybe a few days or a week, of it being particularly prevalent in any one area. But quite often, if you watch out on social media or on the news, you might get to hear that there's been a bloom of sea sparkle. So it's really worth getting out at night to see it.
Excellent. Yeah, I might just have to do that. So something else that I wanted to talk to you about, and we might need to do a little bit of explanation around both these. But it also, the book has a piece in it that is find evidence of sponges and piddocks. Right, so I think before we go into talking about the evidence, for those who might not know, tell us a little bit about what sponges are and a little bit about what piddocks are, and then we can talk about how you can go about finding whether they're there and what the evidence of them is.
No problem at all. So there's a whole section in the book which will help children to find out what the different families of animals and plants are that live on the beach. And then I think this activity is in a section that's more about how they shape the beach, how they make a difference to the beach. And piddocks are what we call a bivalve mollusk, so like a clam shell. Okay, so it's a shell that's got two halves that can open and shut. And they are incredibly fascinating creatures because they have the ability, and they in fact need, to bore into rock to survive. So they have to hide away in holes in the rock to keep themselves safe from predators. Come back to it. Sponges are what they sound like. So sponges are actually little animals, and their bodies, or their colonies they form, are spongy to the touch. So if you touch a sponge, it feels spongy, which is the best way to tell a sponge from various other strange little animals that also live on the rocks and cover them. Sponges are very simple animals. They filter the water and they take out food particles from the water. So sponges, of course, are very soft animals, and you wouldn't really think that they would be able to make holes in anything. But like the piddocks, they also burrow into rock. I'm not entirely clear why they do this, but they do it presumably to keep themselves safe from predators, and to get nutrients. So they burrow into the rock using chemicals. So they effectively sort of dissolve the rock and make holes in it. So the activity in the book is looking for evidence of piddocks and sponges, and looking at the way that these animals can actually break down rocks and shells as well that they live in. So the sponges particularly can live on seashells as well. And so the activity is all about going to the beach and looking really closely at pebbles on the beach, seashells on the beach, and stones, rocks around the beach for any evidence of those little holes. And a rock that has piddocks in it will have quite sort of big, sort of pencil size holes, so you roughly fit a pencil into it. And if you're really lucky and you look down on the holes, you can see the animal in there. moving down. They retreat into their burrow if they sense anything coming close. And what's really exciting, what I love about piddocks is that, well, two things. One is that those holes that they create mean that you have a rock that's effectively porous, has all these little shelters in it, which other animals then use to survive. And one of the things that I quite often see living in them are actually air-breathing insects that find ways down through these holes into cracks in the rock, and they hide there when the tide comes in over their heads because they can't breathe underwater, and they trap little air bubbles in their hairs on their legs to protect themselves, and they wait for the tide to come out, and then they come and scurry over the rocks again. So if you find piddocks, you can often find these strange little insects which, although they can't breathe underwater, live in the sea. So there you go.
Incredible. So, I mean, the book opens up, just like Rock Pool did for me as an adult, this book opens up a whole new dimension on, and for families and for kids, looking at beaches. You know, there are tons of activities in it. I mean, I don't know how many pages, 128 pages. So let's take, so of that, about 125 pages are of activities and things to do on the beach. So you'll never, ever, ever, ever get bored again on a beach. However, we're going to talk a little bit about the book now, but I want to just mention one thing. It was my favorite when I flipped through. It was my favorite question in the book. And I'm not going to let you give an answer because I just want to put it out there so that people can actually go and find out for themselves. And that is, how do starfish scrub their backs? So I'm not going to allow you to answer that, as much as you're probably itching to answer it. I'm not going to allow you, because they've got to go out and find the book, and then they've got to find out, because honestly, you will never, ever get bored again, promise you. Right, so let's just talk about the book again. You did a fantastic book for adults. And when I say adults, you know, it's not from my point of view, because I am an adult, only just. You know, I'm not saying that it can't be read by children. It can be read by children, but it was positioned as sort of on the shelves as an adult book. And any kids that are interested should go and read it, because there's loads of stuff in there. Sea Squirt's biggest fan. So you wrote a great book. And then you decided, right, okay, so rather than follow that up, which a lot of people might have thought of doing with another adult book, you've gone and put together a fantastic book for kids. Why?
For me, I am absolutely passionate about getting young people, all ages really, out onto the beach. I like getting adults out on the beach too, and they respond well to it. But taking children out and seeing that moment where kids find something for themselves, their own discovery, and the amazement and wonder, and the way that kids look so closely and observe things that an adult might not notice. I think, having taken lots of groups out on the beach and really loved that feeling of seeing kids discovering things themselves, I've always been very aware that I can take a few children to the beach. I can take a class, I can take the scout group, I can do all that, and I love doing it. But that's just a few children, and there are other people like me doing it. But there are very few materials available for families and children who don't have an experience growing up by the beach, maybe don't know what they're looking at, don't know where to start, whose kids are asking 1,000 why questions about why is the tide coming, why is the sea salty. And I'm also a big believer in, as you say, kids discovering things for themselves. You know, if all humans are pretty capable of observing and looking at things. It's how we learn. We like to play, we like to get hands-on. Even as adults, it's the way that we learn best about what's out there. So I've been very conscious writing the book. I wanted to create something which enables people to have ideas, to be prompted to go and look at particular things and look closely, but really to discover what's actually there, because every beach is different. So the conclusions won't always be the same, and to take away whatever whatever's most exciting, because like I say, you might go and find a piddock hole, but what's really exciting is that you see this little creature look through your magnifying glass and discover it's a pseudo scorpion. I mean, how cool is that? So, what you find is not necessarily what I think you're going to find, and it's not up to me to say what you should or shouldn't learn from the activity. But in my experience, by being there, by being outdoors, by having face-to-face contact with these amazing creatures, with that outdoor environment, you get to love it. You have an ownership when you find something for yourself. It's your discovery, and there's nothing like that feeling. I think, and it's what brings people later on in life to become conservationists, to care about their environment, to bring up their children to love it too. So what I hope I've created is a handbook that will help anyone who wants to go out and see the beach to really discover it in an in-depth way, which gives them that feeling that this is my beach, I belong here, I understand it.
Excellent. And just because I want to move on to a bit of detective work that you and I are going to do shortly. But before I do, I think a really important point to get across, and you mentioned in the book, is safety on a beach. So just share with people just a few little pointers about, look, you're going to go on a beach, you're going to discover new things. There are cliffs, there's water, there's slippy areas. How do you stay safe on a beach?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I have put it right at the beginning of the book, because before you go to any beach, it's important to understand that beach is, as I said right at the beginning, it's a changing environment. That's what makes it an adventure. That's what makes it exciting. That's why these amazing things live there. And so long as you understand that and you're careful, then you can visit a beach really safely. So there are things that you have to think about before you go to the beach. And the main thing, the first two things are the tides and the weather on the day that you're going. Okay. So ideally, when you visit a beach, particularly if you want to go out and explore, you want to be going when the tide is going out. So if you look up the tide times, there'll be a low tide time. And if you aim to arrive at the beach maybe an hour or two before that low tide time, you know that all the time that you're on the beach exploring, that hour or 2 hours, the sea will be moving away from you, which means that you're not at risk of it coming in, because the sea doesn't always come in a straight line. It can move around you. And if you don't know a beach very well, it can be easy to get cut off. So if you're working with an outgoing tide, you can have a lot more confidence, particularly while you're getting to know a beach. It's important to stay away from the edge of cliffs. We've had a few big cliff falls over the winter and the spring, some of which were being very well publicised. Cliffs are always moving. There are activities in the book to understand how that happens, why it's important to the beach. But we stay well away from them. And when I say well away, the idea is you should really be at least as far away from the cliff as it is tall to be reasonably safe, and to be aware that if you're in an area that has particularly crumbly cliffs that's known for rock falls, to be especially careful with that. And then the weather, it's, if it's stormy, the waves are going to rush in more. You need to be careful and stay away from the edge of the water, particularly. It's for children, I think the thing is, little bodies can get cold very quickly. So, if you're going to a beach and it's cold, wrap up really well, dress for the weather. There's no such thing as bad weather. We go out in everything. But make sure you've got good shoes, good wellies or beach shoes, that you've got warm clothes if it's cold, that you've got layers you can take off if the sun comes out, that you're well covered if it's very sunny, because it's also very exposed to UV. But, with those sort of basic steps, and there's a few little guidelines in the book, do that. Make sure you leave nothing behind you when you leave the beach, so that you're not adding to the beach litter problem. And off you go.
Yeah, and most of all, enjoy it, because it's great. And it's a lot of people do go to the beach already. A lot of families go there. A lot of families go to beach holidays. The book will open up a whole new avenue for exploring. You'll no longer want to just build a sandcastle. You'll just go on the beach and you will spend hours and hours and hours exploring, as the book says, you know, beach exploring, and it's brilliant. And what I want to do is, while we're talking beach exploring, is just have a very quick chat with you about a series that we're going to put together that will help people and families discover stuff on the beach. Because once their eyes are open to what can be discovered on the beach, I think, you know, people will spend a lot more time doing it. So we're going to put something together called Stories from the Strand Line, which will talk about how you find things on the beach, where you find things on the beach, but we'll also tell you what those things are. So a good place to start on that is for you, Heather, to tell us what a strand line is, just so that people understand when we launch this, this is what a strand line is.
Great. So the sea comes in and goes out twice a day in most places. As the sea moves up the beach, it carries with it whatever's been in the water, whatever's been lying on the beach. So it'll bring shells, it'll bring seaweed, all sorts of things. Unfortunately, it can also bring rubbish, and we'll look at that as well, I'm sure. And as the sea goes out again, it leaves that behind. So as you walk onto the beach, you'll often see near the top of the beach, at least one long line of debris, seaweed particularly, but other things too, along the top of the beach. And that is what we call the strand line. And it's where people go, if you've heard people going beach combing, it's where you go to look for interesting things that have been washed up by the tide.
Excellent. Right. So, as I said, we're going to do a piece about that. And I know you've got your table behind you. And hopefully I can ask you to look for something without you falling off the chair. All I want you to do at this point is just choose your favourite find from the strand line and just let's have a look. And we're not going to go in depth about what it is. We'll just say what it is. And then we'll talk about that as we go forward in the Stories from the Strand Line.
Oh, one thing. Okay. If I have to pick one thing, and I have big things as well, big things that might be immediately more exciting. Okay, but I have one thing on my hand, and this is called a violet bubble snail, and it can be found on the Strand Line in the UK. Bright purple snail, sometimes blue. And it's sometimes blown in when we have storms, when we have high winds, and it comes in with some other creatures as well. And that's all I'll say.
Right. I look forward to discovering everything that's on your table. I'm also going to get some of my stuff and bring that along so we can talk about that. Because I've also got a bit of a collection, although at the moment it's all at work, but I will bring it home from work and we'll have a chat about that as well, so that we can make sure that when people go to the beach, they're seeing it from a whole different point of view. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Alan.
Take care. Bye.